Hello, my friends. I am Dawn with Painted Willow Art, and I have another paint-along video for you today. If you watched the last one where we did the little fox, you might notice that my background is a little bit different. I'm painting inside today in my office rather than outside in the studio because the studio is technically my garage. I just took it over and paint out there, and it's heated with propane. And guess who forgot to get the propane tank filled? So we're going to paint in here today. Where we paint makes no difference. What I'm going to show you is how to do a little blue moon, much like this little guy. Won't be exactly like that because that was my practice one. Just kind of figuring out the idea of what we're going to do, but it will be along those lines. So I'm going to flip the camera around and we'll get started, okay? All right, today we're going to paint a little whimsical blue moon. And we're going to use supplies really similar to what we've used on the other projects. And before I get started, I have to apologize if I sound like I've run a 5K while I'm talking. I was sick earlier in the year and I have not breathed right since. So pardon my breathing, today's just one of those days. I haven't just gone and run a 5K, but it might sound like that, so I apologize for that if I sound like I'm huffing and puffing over here. So we're going to use the same basic supplies that we've used in the past. Watercolors. I am going to use my Josie Lewis set again, and there's a reason I'm using this particular set. It's got, maybe we can see here, it's got 3 blues and a purple, and that's what I want for my painting today. So I've got this light blue, this medium blue, and a darker blue, and then I've got a purple, and I'm going to use all 4 of those in this painting today. So what do you do if you do not have 4 different colors of blue? When we get going, I'm going to show you how to mix some of these together to get some of those different kinds of blue, but this palette has what I want in it, so I'm going to be able to use just that one paint palette. Pencil and eraser, like usual. My number 8 round brush. We are going to use a good bit of water today, and so particularly for the background, if you want, you can use a bigger flat wide brush too, and I'll talk more about that when we get to that point. And I've got my white Uniball Signo pen and a Sharpie. May or may not use both of them, but I'm not sure yet, so I've got them both handy. A little plate or something to draw a circle with. How big depends on how big your paper is, so you'll size this appropriately for your paper. If your paper's not, I'm starting with a 9x12. If your paper's not quite that big, you might want something smaller. I think this is an 8-inch dessert plate, but if you're using small paper, you could certainly use something like a jar or a little can to trace around. So just find you something circular that is appropriate for your paper. And I'll show you how we're going to use that in a minute. And then, as usual, I have got a 9x12 piece of Strathmore 400 acrylic paper. I've mentioned in other videos, I prefer this paper because it's a little bit thicker and because it's got a bit of a linen finish to it, so I like the texture on it. It's 236 pound, I believe, paper. Most watercolor paper is 140. If you've got just regular watercolor paper, that's perfectly fine. This just happens to be my preference. So you don't have to run out and buy anything special for this. Whatever watercolor paper you have will work. I do suggest that it be specifically watercolor paper though, at least, so that what you're painting on is at least 140 pound paper or heavier. We're going to use a good bit of water on this one, where we haven't used quite so much water on some of the other paintings. So I am going to tape this down. And again, I like these little canvas boards for this. I flip it over, so I'm taping it to the smooth side because the tape doesn't stick to the canvas side very well. And I'm going to use my washi tape again. And I'm sorry, you guys are going to get the side view today because I don't have quite as much room in here as I do outside to paint. So, like I've done with others in the past, I may decide I want to put this in a frame later. This is a 9x12 piece of paper, so I would want this to go down to an 8x10 finished size. That way it will fit inside of a mat with an 8x10 opening. So I'm going to start my tape right at the edge of my paper, because I know this tape is 1 inch wide. If you have a different width paper, you might need to measure to get your 8 by 10 finish size. But I specifically use 1 inch wide tape so that I don't have to measure. Now, by starting that tape right at the edge of my paper, it doesn't actually secure it to the board. So I'm going to come back over top with another piece, overlapping the edge so I get it taped down to my board. But by starting at the edge, that moves me in 1 inch. And when I do the same thing on the other side, because this paper was 12 inches wide to start with, if I take 1 inch off each end, I have 10 inches for my finished middle size, which is what I'm going for. So we'll put another one here. And if you don't have these canvas boards, again, my goal is not to have you running out to buy specific supplies if you don't have them. Anything with a solid surface will work. I've got a glass cutting board that I use quite often. If you've got a wooden cutting board that has a fairly smooth surface so the tape will stick to it, you could use a wooden cutting board. Anything like that that's a good solid surface that you can tape to will work. Now for my sides, because I know my tape is 1/2 inch, or is 1 inch wide, I'm going to put it so that the edge of my paper is right about the middle of my tape. And I'm going to do the same thing on this side. Because I know this was 9 inches to start with, I need it to come down to 8. So if I take 1/2 inch off here and 1/2 inch off here, I'm down to 8 by 10. So that will fit in a mat that has an 8 by 10 opening, and then I can frame it really easily. So that is our paper taped down. So the first thing we need to do is draw our little moony guy on there. And to make this nice and easy, that's where the plate comes in. So I'm going to flip this plate upside down so that my edge is against the paper. And I'm going to offset it a little bit so that I have some room off the side here, because I might want to draw some doodles or something over there. So I'm going to offset my plate just a little bit. How much is completely up to you. You get to decide. And I'm going to trace around it with my pencil. So that gives me a round shape in there. Actually, I'm going to do this a little darker so you can see it. There we go. How about that? Now, to make the actual moon shape, I'm going to use my plate again. And in this particular case, I want my moon to look like it's kind of looking up a little bit. So I'm going to position my plate so that the edge is right up against, see where that goes off the paper onto the tape, that first line? Let me zoom in here. Whoa. Where that line goes off the paper. I'm going to position my plate so the edge of my plate is right at that. And then keeping that, meeting that line, you can then move your plate, kind of pivot it for however thick you decide you want your moon. I want mine to be, I think, something about like that. So I'm going to draw a line again. And now you can see I've got a moon shape. I'm just going to come in with my eraser and erase this top line. When you're doing this at home, I would suggest that you do these lines very lightly, because as I have told you in the past, if you can see your pencil lines, they're really dark, and you paint over them with watercolor, which is semi-transparent, you might see those lines through. And once you've painted over the top, you're not going to get those lines erased and get them out of there. So I'm going to erase this a little bit before I start painting. I just like it to be nice and dark so that you can see it on the screen. Now, you get to decide, do you want your moon points to be really sharp points like that, or do you want it to be rounded off? I kind of like mine to be rounded off. So I'm going to erase that sharp point right off the tip and just kind of round it off a little bit. And I'm going to do the same thing down here. I'm just going to kind of round it off. and go back and erase the pieces that don't need to be there after you round it off. I'm also going to give my moon a face, so I want a nose and I want a mouth. So I'm going to put a mouth right here. You get to decide where on your moon it's going to be. I want my face to be, you know, kind of centered in my moon, so I'm just going to make a little partially curved line. That's going to be my place marker for my mouth. So I know that his lip is going to come out a little bit from there and out a little bit from there. And let's zoom in so you guys can see that better. There we go. To give the face a little bit of contour, because our faces aren't flat, I don't want to keep this one-dimensional line here. I want his lip to come out a little bit and his bottom lip to come out a little bit. So I'm just adding a little bit of curve at each of those spots, and hopefully you can see how that starts to look like a mouth. And then I'm going to come back and erase that straight line out of the middle. So we get something like that. I want the nose to be just above that, and I want it to come down to maybe right about there, because our noses aren't too high off our top lip. So that's going to be kind of the bottom marker for my nose. And I'm going to start up here just a little bit. You get to decide how big a nose your moon has. I don't want mine to be too terribly big, so I'm going to start on the line up here, and I'm just going to kind of sketchy, bring it down, and think like a backwards J almost. And then I will erase that straight line out of the middle. So there's my nose. And if we zoom back out, you get to see how that's taken on really the look of a face. Now from here, you can play with it a little bit if you want your nose to be a little pointier or a little rounder, depending on how you drew it the first time. Just kind of take a minute and play around with your nose. We are going to bring that nose line up in just a bit, because that's part of what gives it the depth of looking like a face. Mess around with your lips. Just kind of take a second to play around with it. You can erase and redraw as many times as you want to, until you get this looking the way you want it to look. Okay, we are eventually going to put an eye right here. And actually, maybe we should decide, do we want a closed eye or an open eye? I don't know. On my plain round sheet, I did an open eye. I kind of like the open eye. Let's do an open eye. So we'll do that now because we don't want to paint over the eye. Oops. So from where your nose is, your eye is going to come up and over just a little bit. So somewhere right in this vicinity. To start the eye, I'm going to draw a V. And I'm just doing it kind of sketchy so I can erase, but that helps me get a feel for where it is, where it's going to be. Okay, so we're going to do a V. Just a little bit above the nose. And then at the front of this V, we're going to do like a little football shape. So draw kind of an oval shape in between the top line and the bottom line of the V. That's going to be his pupil. So that'll be our eye. We're going to come back and make that eye fancier after we paint. We're just getting our landmarks put in so that we know not to paint over these things. So once you get your eye drawn in, kind of stand back and take a look at it and see, does it look like it's too close to the nose? Does it look like it needs to move up or over? If it does, erase it and just move it where you want it. Again, you're going to start with a V, a sideways V, and then put a little oval at the very front of the V. Okay? Or if you think your eye needs to be bigger, you decide the proportions of your face. We are going to make this a little whimsical. We're going to put some doodles on it like we've done some of the other paintings. So proportions don't have to be exact. We're not really going to worry about that. We just want it to look like an obvious face. If his nose is a little bit wonky, You know, maybe you've got like a little bit of a ridge in his nose, like he broke his nose. That's perfectly fine. If the eye's a little bit crooked, that's okay. Because it's going to be whimsical, we're not really worried about overall proportions and the realistic look of it. We just want the idea of a face. So that's what we've got with this. Okay? So with that, I'm going to adjust my light for a second, and then we will start painting. Okay. I always forget to tell you when we're going through the supplies that a blow dryer is going to be handy too. I have this just cheap little, I don't know, this thing's probably got to be 20 years old, blow dryer that I keep in my studio, but you are going to want a blow dryer, a heat gun, something like that to dry this with, because we're going to have to do this in phases to keep our paints from bleeding into each other. So the first thing I'm going to do is erase these lines just a little bit, so that I'm not going to be able to see them through my paint. So I'm just coming over with an eraser and lightly erasing, leaving just real faint lines there so I can still see where my outline of my moon is and where his eyeball is going to be. But I don't want thick, heavy, dark pencil lines that I have to either try and make sure I cover up or try and get rid of later. Okay, so we're going to take a little sidestep for a minute and talk about mixing paint. So if you got that plate, you can use your plate for this. I mentioned in my palette that I have 4 different blues. I've got a light, a medium, a dark, sorry, 3 different blues, light, medium, dark, and I've got a purple, and I'm going to use all of those because that's going to help me get some dimension. But what happens if you don't have maybe a middle blue? Maybe you have just a light and a dark. You can mix the two. And there's not really a proportion to tell you. The easiest way to do this really is just play with it. And that's what most people do, is just kind of play with mixing it until you get a color you like. So I'm going to get my blue really wet, load up my brush with it, and then come wipe it on the plate. So I'm leaving a puddle of paint there. And I'm going to do the same thing with my really dark blue. I'm going to get it wet. Now, darks are going to overpower lights, so I'm not going to load my brush up as much with the dark as I did with the light. I've got just a little bit on there, and I'm just going to kind of tap it in there so I can get a feel for what that's doing. Now I would like it a little bit darker, so I'm going to get some more, but I'm going to rinse my brush off first, because if I go straight back to that dark blue paint with the lighter paint in my brush, I'm going to contaminate that dark blue. And I don't want them to mix in my palette. I want them mixed here. So I'm going to rinse my brush off real quick, then come back and get some more dark. And I'm just going to keep going with this until I get a nice medium blue. Now what I want to show you, this is the medium blue that I mixed. This is the medium blue in my palette. Pretty darn close. So don't panic if you don't have multiple different blues. It's convenient if you do, but you certainly don't have to have them. If you've got a light and a dark, you can just keep mixing and get everything in between. So I've got my light, I mixed that medium, I put a little bit more dark in it, and that's the dark straight out of the pan. So with just 2 colors, we're going to ignore this one because that's its own blue, but with just those 2 colors, I can just mix myself silly. And I'm really just playing around with it, testing them, till I get a blue that I like. And if you get too much in it, you can just always go back and add some more light in it. So from that light and that dark, I've got all these different shades of blue. There's not a white in the bunch. I didn't put any white in there to lighten it up. I don't like white watercolor because it tends to be really chalky. So if I wanted something lighter than, say, this blue, I'm just not going to load my brush as much. Less paint, more water makes that blue a little bit lighter. So with just 2, you can get an entire spectrum of light to dark blues. So don't panic if you don't have either this palette or a palette that has multiple blues. Like I said, I love this palette for its convenience, because the colors mix well and because it does have like multiple blues, multiple greens, but you certainly don't need it. As long as you've got a light and a dark, you're good to go. And let me show you why I like mixing paint on dinner plates or dessert plates. There we go. I'm ready to mix the next color. All you have to do is wipe it off with a paper towel. Okay, so for my little Moony guy, too many cords in my way. For my little Moony guy, I am going to get him wet first. We didn't do that on the fox on the last video, but I am going to do it on this one because I want my blues to kind of mix and mingle. And we're going to do the same thing with the background here in a minute. So I'm just coming in and painting plain, clean water on my little Moony guy. I'm not getting him sopping wet. We just want kind of a shiny, thin sheen of water. I am not painting over my eye because I want that back part to be white. And if I get that wet, that paint's just going to run right in there. So that's the thing you have to keep in mind with watercolors. Pay attention to your outline when you're doing this, because wherever you get water, that paint's going to want to go. You can always fix that if it does get out in over in here. You can always fix that by just making your moon wider, but if you've already made it pretty wide to begin with, you might not want to do that. That might end up looking the way you don't want it to look. So do be a little bit careful as you're painting your water in, that you're staying within your moon outline. Now, because I started up here and I'm finishing down here, this might start to get a little dry, so I'm just kind of going back over that real quick, making sure everybody's wet. My whole moon. Now, hopefully, what should we, yeah, there we go. You can see it's not sopping wet. It's not dripping anywhere. There's just kind of a shiny sheen over the paper with the water. And I'm going to start this with my lightest blue. So I'm going to put a little bit of paint on my brush. And I'm just going to kind of drag that paint around a little bit. Now, when I'm painting my moon, think about what the moon really looks like. It's got light spots, it's got dark spots. So I'm not going to put a consistent coat over the whole thing. I'm going to go kind of here and there, drop some paint in, spread it around, leave it thicker in some spots than others. Leave some white spots here and there. Maybe leave a spot like that where you don't put anything. Because the paper is wet to start with, that paint's just going to kind of move around and spread out. I am going to make sure I get some paint right up at the edges of my lips and my nose so that we have the definition of the lips and nose. I'm not going to leave white spaces there. So something like that. And then I'm going to come back with my medium blue. And I'm going to get that good and wet. This is still wet, so that's going to help with what I really want this medium blue to do. I'm not going to put a ton of paint on my brush to start with, but I'm just going to kind of tap it up here in the top. And I'm going to tap it down here at the bottom. I want it to run. You see what it did up there? Now, this one down here is not running as much as that one did up there because my paper is warped from the water. So certainly you can pick your paper up, move it around, let that water move it around. If it's not going exactly where you want it to go, just come in lightly with your brush and kind of push it around a little bit. Keeping in mind that your colors, when they're wet, are darker than they're going to dry. So that might look kind of dark, but it's really going to dry quite a bit lighter. And I'm going to kind of just here and there, particularly around the edges, come in and just give him a little bit of a darker contour. Maybe throw a little bit in the middle, leave your white spaces. Because this is all wet, you can see that that's just kind of spreading out and blooming out a little bit. If it starts to feel too dry or your paint's not mixing and mingling well, get your brush wet and come back with just a little bit of water and use your brush to push it around. And we're just putting little bits dark here and there. Now, see that went in pretty dark? Don't panic about that if you get that. Come back with just water on your brush, move it around. Keeping in mind that it is going to dry lighter than it looks right now. Okay, so there's my Moony guy. I like the idea of him being kind of mottled and not one solid color, because the moon isn't solid white. It's got dark spots and light spots and, you know, all kinds of different shades in between. So with him done, let's go dry them. I'm going to dry mine as well. So you guys, if you want to hit pause here, go dry your moon, and then we'll come back and take a look at the background. Okay. Moon is dry. Make sure it is completely dry, because we're going to do a background around this that makes it look like it's night. And remember what I said at the beginning, wherever there's water, the paint is going to want to go. So if this is not dry, if your moon's not dry, and we start putting water and paint out here, it's going to want to run in your moon. And we don't want that. We want to keep the distinction between the moon and the background really distinct. So make sure your moon is good and dry. You can run your hands over it and get a feel for whether there's still any dampness in there. If there is, if it feels like it's still a little bit damp, hit it with the blow dryer again until it's good and dry. Okay? Now, this is where I mentioned the bigger paintbrush earlier. Because this background is so big, if you're using a similar size paper to mine, you might have a good bit of background. If you're using a smaller piece of paper and you've got smaller background, then certainly using the smaller brush to put water on is fine. When you've got a big area like this, though, it can be a lot quicker to use a big brush. So this is just a 1-inch wide watercolor brush. You could use pretty much any flat wide brush to do this. I like the watercolor brushes because they're specifically designed to hold water, and that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to get water on this paper. And I know it's a watercolor brush because of two things. The bristles are really long. That helps them hold the water, and it's really, really soft. If I compare this to, let's say, this brush, granted they're not the same width, but can you see the difference in the bristle lengths? This is an acrylic paintbrush. It's not designed to hold water like this. You could use it. You're just going to have to dip it a little more often. So if you don't have a watercolor brush, again, don't go buy anything unless you really, really want to. If you've got something like this or a little wider, it will work just fine. You're just going to have to dip it in the water a little bit more often. And you can see this one's, it doesn't snap back, or it snaps back a little quicker. It's not quite as soft as this one. Both of those things determine how well it's going to hold water. So longer bristles, softer bristles are going to hold more water than shorter, not as soft, stiffer actually, bristles. But you could still use something like this, okay? So what I'm going to do to start with here, I'm going to use my darker blue, and I'm going to use a little bit of purple for my background. So I'm going to just tap some water in there. And here, let me show you this too, because this is a good trick. It's always a good idea to get your paints wet before you start using them. Let a little bit of water sit on them so that they can start loosening up. I love these little droppers. Get a little bit of water in there, and then just put a couple drops of water on each color that you're going to use, and let them sit for just, it doesn't take very long, 15-20 seconds. It just helps them start to soften up and liquefy. So I'm going to put some water on those paints while I'm getting my background wet. And I'm doing with this the same thing I did with the moon. I'm just doing it with a different brush. I'm coming in with just water on my brush, and I'm painting that water around. Now be careful not to get on your moon. Go right up to the edge, but don't get on your moon. If it's easier to do around his face contours with a smaller brush like we used to paint him with, certainly switch back and forth between your brushes. I'm actually not going to do the whole background with this one because this is not my favorite choice. I would do the whole background with the same brush I painted him with, but I wanted to give you options and let you see that different brushes have different benefits. So I've got that bit of background wet. I'm going to start with that. And then as I move to each section of the background, I'll get it wet as I go. So I'm going to come in and grab some of that darker blue. Ooh, that's good and dark, isn't it? And I'm just going to start kind of smishing it around. There's not really any rhyme or reason to this. Because it's wet, you can see that the paint is kind of dispersing out, which is what I want it to do. I want it to soften itself out, which it's going to. I am going to bring this right up against my little moony guy. And I'm just kind of smushing the paint around because I want the background, how the moon's kind of modeled, I want the background to be the same thing. I just want it to be darker so that it looks like night. So I'm going to be careful around his little lips and nose to make sure we keep the definition there. And if you end up with a little bit of white space between your paint and your moon, it's okay because we're ultimately going to outline the moon. But do try and run it just right along the edge of your moon there. And then I'm going to come back with a little bit of purple and put some purple in the other spots. And I'm just smushing it around as well because everything's wet. Those colors should merge together. How much purple versus how much blue is completely up to you. Do you like a nice purple night sky? Or do you like a nice blue night sky? So you see, I'm not being terribly careful. I'm just kind of smushing these colors around because everything's wet. They're all just going to merge together. Now I'm going to flip this around because I'm going to keep my wet edge. So I'm going to start from the wet edge and I'm going to work my way around. And the reason I'm doing that is because if this edge gets dry, you're going to have a hard line there. And I don't want a hard line. I want my sky to look continuous. If you do end up with a little bit of a dry edge, like right there, just come back with some water on your brush and kind of scrub it over it for a minute. And it should soften up that hard line. So I'm just going to come in and continue this all the way around. I'm getting my paper wet. And I don't know if you can tell on camera, but there's a little bit of kind of bluey purple in the water that I'm painting on because I'm using the water I rinsed my brush out with. And that's perfectly okay because I'm putting blue and purple here, so I don't care if the water has a little bit of a blue cast to it. I would not want to use water that maybe I had rinsed a red brush in for this because that's not going to give me the look that I want, or an orange or a green. But because I used blue and purple and I'm continuing to use blue and purple, it's okay if that water has a little bit of a tint to it. So I'm just going to continue doing the same thing. I'm going to come back in with my blue again. And I'm just smushing it around kind of randomly. Do get it right up against the edge of your moon. That's some kind of paint technique, isn't it? All over the place. But that's how we get kind of that mushed up, mingled together paint look. Right? Now, I don't have any water down over here yet, and I just ran that paint right up against that dry area. So I'm just going to continue putting some water down there so I don't end up with a dry edge there. You do not want a dry edge. And I'm going to come back and throw some purple in. Move the purple around. Now keep in mind, like I said earlier, your paint is going to dry lighter than it looks right now. So don't let the darkness of these colors freak you out. Although we do want this to look like a night sky, it is going to dry lighter. So once it's dry, if you're not real excited about the way it looks, you can come back over it with another coat of paint, and we're actually going to do that. So you can see what that does and how it can change it. But we've got to get the first one on here first before we can do a second. So you're just going to continue all the way around your background the same way. Get it wet first. Come in with your darker blue. And we're just smushing it around. There's really no rhyme or reason to how this paint is going in or on. Put a little more dark blue up there. And then I'm going to come back in with a little bit of purple and smush it around. There is a good bit of water on this paper right now. So you might find that your paper is trying to warp pretty badly. It's completely okay. Sometimes when it's doing that, you can tip your painting up. I don't know if you can see on camera, it's kind of hard to see how that's starting to run. You can tip it around, make that paint move and slide, and that just helps the colors mix together better. All right, so pause the video here and go dry your painting, or set it aside and come back tomorrow if you don't have a blow dryer. I'm going to dry mine again, and then we'll take a look at a second coat on this, and I'll talk a little bit about why you would do a second coat. So go dry your painting and then come back. Okay, my background is dry. Let's talk a minute about second coats. Watercolor paint is partially transparent, semi-transparent, which means you're going to see layers through it. That's part of what gives it its luminescence. Watercolor tends to have a bit more of a, I don't want to say shine, but it looks like it has more light in it than a lot of other types of paint do because of that semi-transparency. The more layers you put on, you can see the lower layers come up through the top layers. So for something like this background, you can see that my sample one that I did is a good bit darker than this one. You get to decide at this point how dark you want your background. Now, I will caution you, we're going to do doodles on this, and I'm going to use a black pen. So I don't want my background too terribly dark. If you want yours really dark so that it looks like midnight, certainly you can do that, but then you might want to do your doodles with a white pen instead. Now, I do think I want more blue than purple. You can see mine's fairly purple right now. So I am going to come back with another light coat of that darker blue. So I'm just getting my paint wet again so that it's good and thin and inky. And I'm just going to come back over, wet this again, just like we did the first time. You don't want to scrub it too much because when you get this wet, you're re-wetting the paint that's on your paper. I don't know if you can see on camera that it's starting to spread a little bit and move just by getting it wet again. So you don't want to scrub it real hard. You just want to get it wet. And then I'm going to come back in with a little bit more of that blue and just kind of put another light coat of that dark blue here and there. And what that's going to do is tone down some of that purple. I'm still going to see bits of purple through it. It's just going to tone down the purple a little bit because I got heavy-handed with the purple, which I always do because I love the purple. So I'm just going to continue that all the way around. I'm just going to put another light coat of that darker blue. So again, we're going to get everything wet. Put a coat of water first. Just don't scrub it too terribly much, or you're going to start seeing brush strokes in it. What happens if you do scrub it too much and you get brush strokes? Well, if you're coming back with another color like this, chances are that color is going to cover up some of those brush strokes. So I wouldn't worry about it too terribly much. And I think I want to go darker up here in the corners just so that it looks like it's got maybe a little bit of a darker border to it. So I'm going to come back and put a little bit more paint right in the corners. So if you like your background how it is, certainly leave it. You do not have to do a second coat. I'm just trying to tone down some of my purple a little bit. I want it to be a little more bluer, and that's just because that's what my eye wanted. There's really no rhyme or reason, no perfect way to do it. That's just, in looking at it, I decided I wanted a little more blue. So that's what I'm doing, more blue. And it might look like I'm working fairly quick. I am, because I want this to stay wet. I don't want to be doing this on dry paper because I want these colors to merge and blend together. And they do that best when the paper's wet. So there we go. So now I'm going to go dry this again. If you are doing a second coat on yours, certainly you didn't have to do it as fast as I did. If you're still painting, pause the video here. Finish your second coat and then go hit it with the blow dryer again, and then we will come back and put some doodles on him and define him a little bit, okay? Okay, I'm back and I have got mine all dry. What do you think? Hot mess at this point, right? I don't know about how yours looks, but this is the point in a painting when I look at mine and go, oh, just yuck. Every painting, drawing, anything goes through an ugly stage. For me, this is the ugly stage. I am not liking this at all. But what I know is that I'm going to add some things to it that are drastically going to change it. So let's set about doing that. The painting part is done, so now I'm going to come back with my trusty Sharpie. And I'm going to start embellishing this. I'm going to outline it, and we're going to start putting some doodles on it. Okay? So first thing I'm going to do is come in and give him a bit of an outline. This is where I mentioned earlier, if you've got a little bit of white space between your background and the moon, you can cover it up. You can do that with a pen. And you do not have to make this outline perfectly straight and smooth. You can make it a little sketchy if you want. I think for the whimsical look of this, that sketchiness kind of gives it a little bit of character. So we're just going to go all the way around the moon, outlining its shape. If you need to cover up some of your white spots, certainly do that with the pen. And like I said, I'm not doing it real strictly and carefully. I'm kind of sketching it. So it's not going to have one solid outline. It's going to have kind of a sketchy outline, which I am completely okay with. Remember, turn your paper if it makes it easier to work with. You do not have to leave it facing the same direction all the time. Make it easy on yourself. Now, for the face, when I get around to the nose here, I'm going to bring that line in just a little bit. So that helps define the nose. And I'm going to do the same thing where I had that little half circle for the mouth. I'm going to bring that mouth line all the way in there. That way I get the definition of my face. And there we go. Just the outlining alone makes a huge difference. Now for the eye, I'm essentially going to outline this. So I'm going to start with my V. And I'm going to put a little oval in there. And then I'm going to draw like a little circle right there. That part inside there is going to stay white. The rest of it is going to get blacked in. There we go. So we got an eyeball. Now I do want to give a little bit of a look of an eyelid on here. So I'm just going to kind of come off the top a little bit and thicken that line. Make it a little thicker at the front and run it back down into the line itself. So it's thicker up here, thinner down here. Hopefully we can see that. I'll do it again on the bottom one. I'm just going to start right at the end here and kind of make it a little thicker. And then run it back onto itself. So I've got thicker at the front, thinner at the back. Thicker at the front, thinner at the back. Now we need to give and put an eyebrow on him. So I'm going to do it with my pen first. If the idea of drawing on your painting with a pen that's permanent for something you don't already have marked freaks you out a little bit, do it in pencil. I mentioned at the beginning, if you paint over the pencil, you're never going to get it erased. If you put pencil on top of the paint, you can erase it. I would just do it very, very lightly. So if you want to sketch your eyebrow in with a pencil first, go ahead. I'm going to be bold and just do it with my pen. So I'm just going to do something like that, right at the top of the eye. Kind of like a little backwards J again. I'm not going to make the front really long, but then just run it back a little bit. So that gives a little bit of an eyebrow. So there we go. Already makes a difference with that eye blacked in, doesn't it? So from here, we're going to set about making this dude a little more whimsical looking. So to do that, we're going to do much like we did on the fox. We're going to put some things coming off of it. We're going to give it some character on the face. So first thing I'm going to do is maybe just give it a little bit of a line there on the nose, just to kind of accentuate the nose a little bit. Yeah, give him a little bit of a curve on his mouth for a smile. And the moon is rather beaten up. Our moon is not perfectly smooth and round. It has craters in it. So maybe I'm going to go up here and give him a little crater or two. Right? Down here, maybe I'm going to do a circle crater. And maybe put a couple more craters right over here. Poor guy's been beaten up. You can come in with just a few lines here and there. Something like that. I am also going to put some things hanging off the tip. So off of this tip up here at the top, I'm going to put, maybe, let's see, what are we going to put? Let's put a planet, like Saturn, because it has rings, so that's kind of fun, and a couple of stars, and maybe a heart. So it's going to look like it's got a little tassel hanging off its head. So I'm going to come over here and draw a circle. And then, can you guys see this on camera? Drawing with black ink on dark paint. There we go. That might be a little bit better, huh? So I'm going to do a circle. This is going to be my planet. Saturn has a ring. So on one edge, I'm just going to kind of draw out across it and back. So that looks like Saturn with its rings. And then I'm going to come over here and do a star. And then over here, maybe a little heart. And then maybe another star down here. Now, like I said at the beginning, if your background is really, really dark and this black might not show up, you could do the same thing with a white pen. And then for each of these things, I'm just going to draw kind of a curvy line coming down to each of them. Like it's attaching each of them to the top. And you can see that curvy line, I let it overlap, so I didn't go like one here, one here, one here, one here. They overlapped each other, which is what makes it look more like a tassel. And if you want to, you can add like some little dots on those lines. Gives it a little bit more character. This is what the whimsical part is all about. You're just adding random little things that give it some character. And those random little things don't have to be complicated. Circles and dots will do it. I'm going to zoom this back out a little bit. And maybe up over here, I want to have some little hearts coming off. So I'm going to put a couple of hearts over here. I'm doing them at different heights. And I'm going to black them in. And then I'm going to draw wavy little lines, but I'm going to go across its border down onto the moon itself. And then I'm going to put a little curve there. So hopefully you can see that kind of makes those hearts look like they're coming out of the surface of the moon. And I'm going to come down here. And my little moon is thinking about its counterpart, the sun. So off the curve of my little moon down here, I'm going to put a sun. So I'm just going to put a half circle, like the sun is partially behind the moon. And then for my rays of the sun, I'm going to just use lines and dots. So I might start with a longer line and a couple of dots and then a shorter line. And I'm going to vary the length of these all the way around so they're not all exactly the same height. For this one, I might start with a couple of dots and a little line, and then a longer line. So I'm just going to work my way around doing lines and dots for my rays of my sun. So there we go. So you can see coming out of the bottom of my little moon, I have a sun. And if you wanted to add, you know, some additional lines in there like that to define your sun, you certainly could. I think, what do I think? I think down here on the bottom, I'm going to do some little dangly things off the bottom too. And again, with this, we're going for basic shapes, basic lines, nothing terribly complicated. So let me make sure you guys can see this. I'm thinking now, I'm wishing I'd have left a little more space at the bottom and not quite as much at the top, but that's okay. We can make this work anyway. So I think what I want to do is have somewhere between 3 and 5 things hanging off, and I want them to be like between here. So I'm going to do one here, one here, one there to start with, and I may add more to that. We'll just have to see what it looks like. So what I'm going to do is make these, you know, kind of like I did at top for the tassel. I'm going to make these little dangly things hanging off. So this first one, I'm going to come down and make like a mustache shape. And then a half a diamond at the bottom. And I'm going to put some lines in it. Actually, I don't like the lines, so I'm going to black it in. And I might make these really curly at the top, like a handlebar mustache. And then I'm going to come down and put a circle. And then I'm going to come down and just put a big curly Q at the bottom. And then for this one, what am I going to do for this one? I'm going to come down and put a big circle. And I don't really have a plan. I'm just kind of making these up as I go. So that's kind of the idea of this. And I think now that I look at them, I'm going to put them up into the moon a little bit and do the same thing I did with the hearts. I'm going to put a little curve at the top so they look like they're coming right out of the moon. And then I'm going to bring my line down and put another circle. And then I think out of this circle, I'm going to do like a curvy teardrop shape. If you want to practice these before you start doodling on your painting, certainly grab another piece of paper and play around with these. That one I showed you at the beginning, I did all kinds of messing around on it. It's not cohesive. There's nothing good about it, really, in terms of it being pleasing to look at, but that was my test. I was just playing around with a concept, trying to get an idea of what I thought I wanted to do. So on this one, I think we're going to put a diamond here, and we're going to leave that one open, and then come down and do a couple of dots, and then put a big curly Q at the bottom of this one with a dot on it. So those are great coming down off the moon, but they don't feel like they kind of belong together. So what I'm going to do from the top of each of these lines is draw a curved line to the other one. So think of like chain hanging or string hanging things, right? And I'm going to put some little dots on those lines. Just kind of gives it the look of chain or something like that. Hooking those together. Now I am going to run this off the side and give it some more dots, just so it looks like it's not stopping at either one of those. It's just kind of hanging loose. There we go. Now, those 3 don't feel like enough to me. So I'm going to put another one. I'm going to use a wavy line on this one with a heart on it. And another one off here with a little star on it. And I'm making these not quite as long as the other 3, so there's a little bit of movement there. Okay. What else do we want on our little Moony? Maybe I want some stars coming off over here. So I'm going to do like I did the hearts. I'm going to draw a couple of stars, varying their height, varying their size. And maybe I'm going to put a little moon shape up here as well. And another one right here. And I'm going to do just like I did on the hearts. I'm going to draw kind of a wavy line down into the moon, put a little curve on it. And I think my little Moony guys, I'm just going to run right down in to start with some of the stars. So at this point, we would just continue putting whatever we wanted to put on our little moon. I think I'm going to make that a little crater right there. And maybe I'm going to make more craters up there. And another little set of craters right there. So you would just keep doodling and adding things to your moon until it feels like it's complete to you. I am of the opinion that the more doodles, the better. I think even if your doodles aren't the same thing, you know, hearts and stars aren't the same, the planet's not the same, none of those things are the same, but because we're doing them all in black, it gives them a little bit of a cohesive feel. And the more you put on there, the more character this little guy is going to get. Yeah, I might want to put, I'm going to put one little star coming up right there, coming up onto the moon itself. No, he needs another one. So you just keep doodling and drawing things on there until it feels complete to you. I am a fan of groupings of 3 and 5. Typically those tend to be a little more visually appealing than even numbers. So you just keep going, knock yourself out. Put as many craters on there as you want. Little contour lines. If you want to come back on some of these black pieces that are out here like the hearts and put a little white highlight on them, certainly do that. That's going to give them more character still. If you want to do the same thing on your moons and stars, certainly do that. So you would just keep doodling and drawing until you feel like you've got enough on there, until it makes you happy. That's, I think, where I'm going to end mine as far as doodles. I don't know. I might come back and do some more doodles on it later. But when I'm looking at this, for me, the doodles feel good. I like the character it's given him. And you can see, even with just that, it's really made a huge difference from before we put any of that pen on there. From the hot mess stage to now is a big difference with just a little bit of ink. But to me, the background still needs something. This is awful plain compared to this. So I want to put some stars on here. And I'm going to show you how to do some stars. We're going to do it kind of like we did the splatters on the background for the little fox. So for this, and I forgot to tell you about the supply at the beginning, I always leave one out, don't I? For this, I've got Dr. P.H. Martin white pen ink. I think this same brand has a bleed proof white ink. I like this because it's already inky consistency. It comes with a dropper. It's already an inky consistency. If you don't want to have to go out and buy something like this, and you have white acrylic paint, you can do the same thing. You're just going to water down your white acrylic paint a little bit so that it's an inky consistency. And if you watch the Fox video, we're going to do essentially the same thing we did. I've got my brush wet. It's clean, but it's wet. And I'm going to run it through this white ink. So that's going to water it down just a little bit. And I'm loading up my brush. So I have a ton of white on there. And I'm going to come over my moon and I'm just going to tap. And as I tap, that white's going to drip off. I'm trying to keep it out on the background. I'm not trying to go over my moon. Although if I get a little bit on my moon, I'm not going to panic. It will be okay. I'm just adding some of these little white splops to my painting. So we end up with that. That's better. So if you've done this, pause the video here and go blow dry these because I need the ink to be dry to show you the next thing that we're going to do. So I'm going to pause here, go dry mine, and I will be right back. All right, I'm back with my ink dry. If you want to add just a little bit more to this, you can turn some of these ink splops into things that look more like a star. If you've got a white pen, you can pick just a few here and there. You don't need to do it on a lot of them. Pick a blob and just run, watch, my white pen's not going to work. Just run a line out all four sides of that white blob. We'll do the same thing down here for this one. And let's see, let's zoom in here so you can see this closer. Maybe we'll do this one right here. So I'm just running a line, and white pens can be finicky sometimes. You might have to scrub it off on a piece of paper off to the side. So I'm just running a line out of it to give it a little bit more of a star shape. And I might do the same thing with this little guy right here. So you can see where I put the crosses on those little blobs, give it a little more of a star look. So I think at that point, I'm going to call mine done. I think I mentioned in the Fox video that splatter technique. If you're not comfortable with that, I want to practice first before you do it on your painting. Certainly grab you a scrap piece of paper and play around with that idea of getting a lot of ink or a lot of paint in your brush and then tapping it to make splotches. You could have done those splotches in a different color. We could have used maybe purple or hot pink to do them. I like the contrast of the white on this particular one, but certainly you're always welcome to use whatever colors you want. And even with the overall composition itself, because I did mine in blues and purples doesn't mean you have to. You know, certainly sometimes the moon is in the sky in the morning as the sun's coming up. So maybe you have a blue moon and you have a blue and orange and pink sky at sunrise. You could try that. This is just meant as a jumping off place to give you a place to start with drawing something and then the painting techniques to support it. So the moon, for instance, you could certainly freehand that if you want to, but if you're not comfortable in your drawing skills, then using something like a plate as a template is perfectly fine. Whatever tools work to get you to the point that you're actually creating. I like the idea of the doodles being just basic shapes because those are really something pretty much anybody can do. And yet when you put a bunch of them together, they start to look pretty cool, even though they're not terribly complicated to do. So this is the kind of project that you could sit down and realistically, I know the video takes a little longer because I'm talking and explaining, but if you're sitting and doing this by yourself and you've got a blow dryer to work with, you could sit and do something like this start to finish in the half an hour, 45 minutes. So you don't need a lot of time to sit and work on something. And there's absolutely no reason you couldn't start it today. Maybe get your moon done. You got 10 or 15 minutes. Walk away from it. and come back to it tomorrow and do the background tomorrow. And then, you know, you got 10 or 15 minutes for that. And come back and do your doodles the next day. So certainly you don't have to sit and finish these projects all in one sitting either. You can step away from them. You know, sometimes it's not a bad thing. Paint the moon, walk away, come back to it tomorrow. That moon's going to be good and dry before you start, so you don't need a blow dryer. So like I said, these projects are just meant for as jumping off places to get you started, get you painting, get you drawing, get you I can't even talk. Get you creating. So I think that's all I've got for you on this one. I do have a couple last things I'm going to tell you that are not necessarily painting related. And while I do that, I'm going to pull the tape off, because pulling the tape off is the most rewarding part, because that's when it looks like a finished painting. So remember, when you pull your tape off, to pull it off at an angle away from the paper, because sometimes the tape will rip the paper. If it does, if you're pulling it away, it will rip out instead of ripping into your painting. So while I pull the tape, I would like to thank you all for watching. For some reason, in the last couple of weeks, the views on these paint-along videos have skyrocketed, and I don't know why, but I am so happy, and I thank you all for watching. I hope that you're watching them and then going and trying the projects. If you are and you have questions, I read and respond to every single comment that comes on a video. So certainly if you get into a project and you have questions, put those questions in the comments and I will answer them. I don't check the comments every day. I do it every couple of days. So it might be a day or two before you get a response, but I will absolutely respond to questions and help wherever I can. If you want to follow along with other art that I make and other classes that I teach, I post about those on Instagram and Facebook. I am at Painted Willow Art on both. I would love to have you join me over there. If you feel brave enough to share the things you're creating on your social media, please tag me at Painted Willow Art, whether it's Facebook or Instagram, so that I can see. I would love, 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 love to see what you all are creating. I think it's inspiring to see the creativity everybody else comes out with. And absolutely subscribe to this channel, because I've got more videos coming. I think I've got the next 3 planned, so I'm going to try and film them this weekend as well, although I'll probably put them out a week apart, so you've got some time in between to play. And even though I didn't do it here, I am going to do it before I'm done with this. Remember to always sign your art, whether it's your name or your initials, something that identifies you, and put the date on it. And I think the date is important, whether you do it on the front, whether you do it on the back, because the more you practice these skills, the better you're going to get. And it's really interesting to me to watch my art evolve over time. So where we're at the beginning of 2021, date this if you paint this. And continue to paint, continue to practice, continue to do things. And at the end of the year, pull them all back out and look at them and see how your art has changed from today versus where it'll be at the end of the year. I think you will be pleasantly surprised at how you will progress just through continual practice. And by continual practice, I don't mean you have to do this every day, but once a week, sit down and draw something, paint something, and just play with your materials, play with your paints, play with your papers, and watch how your skills develop. It's really quite stunning sometimes to see the difference over a period of time. So absolutely remember to sign and date your paintings. And I think that's all I've got for you right now. So hopefully you enjoyed this one. Like I said, if you do run into any questions, put them in the comments. I will answer them. And if you'd like to follow along, I am at Painted Willow Art on Facebook and Instagram. And I would love it if you subscribe to my YouTube channel here so that you get notified every time there's a new paint along. All right? Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.